Welcome. Good morning. I want to thank you for braving the cold to be here with us today. My name is Alex Brody. I am the Director of Meetings here for the Association of the United States Army. And before I introduce General Ham, I do have just a few announcements to make. Who here is a member of AUSA? We want to thank you sincerely for your support of our organization. I am pleased to report that as of this month, we are over 168,000 members, which, as I understand it, is an all-time high. So thank you again. That being said, our goal by the end of the year is 175,000 members of AUSA. So for those of you that are not a member and would like to learn more about becoming one, please stop by our registration desk on our way out. Ask for Christine Lathrop. She is our Deputy Director for Membership, and she'll be happy to go over all the great benefits of AUSA. We do have an alert right now. We have a new format for our Q&A today. Typically, I walk the room with a mic at the end after our speaker is finished. I will not be doing that today. Instead, we ask that you go to this website, www.ausa.org/Q&A, and go ahead and enter your questions. You can use your iPhone, your iPad, your Android, any kind of personal device that can connect to the internet to enter your questions. We're going to give that a shot. I think it's going to work great. And finally, for those of you that drove and parked in our Crystal parking lot down the road near Whole Foods, we just ask that you remember to pick up your validation on the way out. With that, I'd like to introduce our President and CEO. Please put your hands together for General Carter Ham.
Good. Thanks, Alex, and welcome one and all. For those of you who have been participating in AUSA events for a while, you may recall that for the past several events, we've introduced Alex as the acting director for meetings. And given the success of the annual meeting in October that Alex oversaw, acting has been removed. Congratulations. That's it. So one note of caution to the asking questions via the devices that you may have. Mr. Lewis, your flip phone will not work. All right, I just want to make sure that you understand that. But it'll be a good way to do it. Hey, we are really, really glad that you're here, and I think by the size of the turnout, obviously a very, very important topic for us this morning as the Army continues its programs to improve the management of talent and people for the United States Army. These events, these breakfasts, other events that AUSA conducts are frankly only possible by your membership and by the great sponsorship of many of our corporate members. This morning's breakfast, we are very pleased, is sponsored by SOS International, represented this morning by Senior Vice President, Lieutenant General Retired Frank Helmick. Frank, thank you very, very much. I encourage you to learn more about SOS International. They provide specialized services supporting the national security interests of the United States, our allies and partners. Been a great partner for AUSA. And again, Frank, thank you very, very much for your sponsorship. We simply cannot do these events without we consider all of you to be distinguished guests, and we are very well, with the exception of Major Cooper. Major Brad Cooper, who is now on the Talent Management Task Force, is a former Army fellow here at AUSA. We're pretty sure he has some due outs. He still owes us, but we'll see how that works out. But let me recognize a few distinguished visitors or participants that have joined us this morning. Dr. Casey Wardinsky, Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs. Dr. Wardinsky, thank you very, very much for joining us. The two hardest working people on the third floor of the Pentagon, Lieutenant General Walt Pyatt, the Director of the Army Staff, and Ms. Kathy Miller, the Executive Assistant for the Secretary of the Army. Thank you both for being here this morning. Lieutenant General Karen Gibson from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Karen, thank you very much for joining us this morning. The 13th Sergeant Major of the Army, Sergeant Major of the Army, retired Ken Preston, our very own Vice President for NCO and Soldier Programs. SMA Preston. I think I saw Major General Chris Hughes, Civilian Aide to the Secretary of the Army for Iowa West. I think, Chris, is that right? Good. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for joining us here as well. And a special welcome to our allies and partners who are here from other nations. And I think we even found a visitor from the United States Navy. There she is. All right, we're very happy that you're here. We hope you win every football game but one. That's right. A couple of upcoming events to take note of for your calendars. Next week, 20 and 21 November, we'll be in Detroit because it's not cold enough in Washington, so we thought we needed to go to Detroit in the end of November. But joining us for an Army Autonomy and Artificial Intelligence Symposium, the second of which we'll host this year. We look forward to those of you who will join us in Detroit. Those of you who aren't going to travel to Detroit, we hope you will come back here on December 4th for a day-long topic on acquisition and contracts, our Hot Topic series. We think very, very timely topic for us to talk about as we close out our events for a year, for the 2019 calendar year. And just to make sure that you're really forward planning, I think, General McQuistion, 333 days before the start of the AUSA annual meeting in 2020. It seems like a long way away, but it comes in pretty quickly. We'll hope you'll hold those dates for us. This morning, we're very privileged to hear from a distinguished soldier, experienced soldier, one who many of you know has an extraordinarily diverse background, a combat veteran, well experienced, and an accomplished infantry leader, but has gone on to do some, he would probably say, uncomfortable positions that the Army sometimes thrusts leaders into. As the J3 for Army Cyber Command, and now as the director of the Army Talent Management Task Force. I would argue no one better in the Army to take on that interesting challenge, very high priority for the Secretary and for the Chief of Staff of the Army, as you know. And if you were at AUSA, or if you followed any of the Chief and the Secretary's public statements over the past several months, you recognize that while it is absolutely essential that the Army modernize its equipment and its capabilities, it doesn't matter if you don't have the right people at the right place at the right time. So please welcome the guy who's charged with helping the Chief and the Secretary accomplish that, Major General J.P. McGee. Thanks.
General Ham, thank you for that introduction. Dr. Rudinsky, General Pyatt, General Gibson, Mr. Lewis, ma'am. So it's great to be here. I feel like every 4 to 5 months I get an opportunity to come back here to AUSA, and I always feel like I'm like defending my dissertation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for maybe 20, 25 minutes and try to frame to you what we're doing, talk to you about an overview of sort of our approach to how we're trying to reform the way we manage the officer corps as a first step towards changing the way we manage our people nested within the Army's people strategy. And then I'd like to open up for questions because I think it's probably the most fruitful and best part of this discussion. But if you don't understand sort of our overarching view and the initiatives we're doing right now that I think you'd be very interested in, I think it'll help drive a whole lot of questions. So next slide, please. So next, keep on going. Okay, so how we nest at the core of what the Army is trying to do for modernizing, we've got this new concept for operations called multi-domain operations. We've got Army Futures Command, which is helping us see the future in terms of how we acquire technology and get ready to fight in it. But at the core of everything that we do as an Army is our people, because we uniquely put technology on people. We don't put people in technology. And the Chief and the Secretary have made people their priority in terms of how we're moving forward as an Army. The Chief has repeatedly said what we need to have is a 21st century talent management system powered by information technology. Okay, so what does that mean as a sort of philosophical approach in terms of where the tensions exist? So much of what we do right now with our people, specifically with the Officer Corps, is directed by two pieces of legislation. So it's the 1947 Officer Personnel Act and the 1980 Defense Officers Personal Management Act. Both of those are really the distillation of the best practices of the day, and that was firmly rooted in the whole sort of industrial age practices of how we managed our people. And simply put, if you're an industrial age organization, what you say is, if you're the Army, you've got to bring in a tremendous number of people every year. Your real core mission is to get everybody to a minimum acceptable level of competence, and at that point, you can sort of jam everybody into a job because they've all reached a minimum level of competence. And then because the size of the cohorts that you're managing are so large, the only way you can do it is to do it with this time-based conveyor belt system, because it's the only management tool you can have for how you do that. Made a lot of sense in 1947, made a lot of sense in 1980 as we transitioned. Doesn't make as much sense as we have all these advancements in information technology and new insights on how to better manage people. So that moves us to talent management. So if the industrial aged approach is really about performance management and quantity distribution, which is really what the focus is, it's much more about quantity than about talents or about quality. Then as you start looking at an information aged approach, what that says the institutional requirements are to bring people in, to take a unique understanding of their knowledge, skills, behaviors, and preferences, what we call talents, and then use that over a career to manage them so they can most contribute to the mission of the United States Army. It's a simple recognition to this question, like, who's the best officer in this room? The answer is, well, we all know General Ham. But after that, but the real answer is, what job are you considering them for? And finding that uniqueness out and then being able to maximize that for the development and employment of the officer corps is what's really critical for as we're trying to move this forward. You can't do that with the current system that we have because we continue to work in an environment that is data poor. Okay, so one of the core challenges to move us towards an information age sort of system is one that gathers much more information about our people so we can manage them differently and much more effectively. And so as we talk about these initiatives we roll out, you'll see there are pieces that we're doing, but at the core of it, a lot of it has to do with gathering the right data to better manage and be able to answer questions for an individual and an institution in terms of how we manage our officer corps. The guidance to us has been very simple, and that is don't go for small changes, go for dramatic changes. So everything we're going to talk to you about are fundamental shifts in the way that we do it. Again, I think you will see that one of the consistent challenges is to get better information about our officer corps so we can manage them not just on two variables, infantry captain, but on many more variables to make better teams and to make better and more effective organizations. The guidance to us from the chief and the secretary has not been to take the current system and make tweaks on the margin. It's not to make the current system better, but to make a new and better system. And our changes are driving us aggressively towards being able to do that in terms of how we do that. Just a couple of reasons why. People define our Army. We're unique in that as a culture. It's not about the technology. It's about the people. And we think that we are losing our position to be what the chief wants us to be, which is the premier human development organization within the world. We need to be able to do this to remain competitive against near-peer competitors, where many of our traditional advantages are now being eroded: size of population, size of economy, technological sort of advantages. We need to maximize where our strengths are, and one of our strengths as an Army is the people that we bring and the leaders that we develop. You don't do that with a system that is really effectively antiquated and doesn't do enough to harness the very best talents. At the core of what we're doing right now, and I find this interesting because we've got industry people here as well, is a recognition what industry has already figured out, I think, across the board. So one of the things industry has figured out is I cannot attach these things to my belt. Let's see, there we go. Can you still hear me? Okay. But it's interesting when you go out there and you talk to industry leaders and they talk about the management of their people, they will all use the same term. And they will say that they are in a war for talent. Okay? They are taking Army terms, military terms, and that's the way and the intensity they look at how they're trying to retain their best and brightest and sort of maximize their potential. And the Army, I would say, has not yet, but is in the process of adopting that method, that sort of mindset. That we're in a war for talent to retain the best and or so they can contribute to the mission of the Army over the long term. And I just find it interesting that, you know, that is not new. I mean, it's industry that is adopting this idea of a war for talent, and, you know, the Army has not yet quite gotten there. And I think it's one of the things that we need to start recognizing as senior leaders is that the incredibly competitive nature for the exact same group of people that we want to retain in the Army are the same people that other government organizations want to retain, or the same thing that other big corporations want to retain. And how we fight that war on talent is going to be very decisive about how we fight future wars. Then the other piece of this is we've got to have the right skill sets in order to adapt to the technological changes that are coming at us rapidly. You look back at the last 15, 20 years, the rate of technological change was very rapid. I mean, you know, we didn't have an iPhone 20 years ago. think about how that's transformed and all this. The changes that are coming to us now over the next 20 years are going to happen even much more rapidly. How the Army takes these technological changes, which are largely being developed in the civilian world, and fold them into our ability to fight future wars is absolutely critical. And you don't do that with a rigid personnel system that doesn't adjust and adapt. And then finally, there is this changing generational norms in terms of the expectation of officers who are coming in, and the Army's lifestyle and the way we accommodate our officer corps, manage them, has to change in order to reflect some of the emerging realities. The emergence of dual spouse incomes being, households with two spouses who are both working and professionals, that is a much larger, percentage of the population. Right now, some studies will say up to 65% of American households now are dual income households. Okay, how the Army moves to accommodate that is going to be one of the key challenges for how we retain our best and brightest in order to keep them in the Army to contribute. Next slide. I won't go into this too much detail, but I think this highlights a number of the issues that we have right now. Okay, so the attrition-based model is what we've been operating off of, and effectively it institutionalizes many of these industrial approaches. Okay, so take a look at year group 11. Let's just start on the left. So this is just active duty officers, but the numbers I think are fairly important for everybody to understand, and they highlight, one, how we run our system, and two, what a future system might look like. Okay, so every year in the active component, the Army has to bring in about 5,000 officers. 1,000 from OCS, 1,000 from West Point, about 3,000 from ROTC. Okay, on top of that, ROTC needs to produce another 2,500 officers to put in the Guard and the Reserve. Okay, so ROTC's induction mission every year, they need to produce about 5,500 ROTC second lieutenants just to meet their mission. Okay, we do that because we really don't have any idea of what we're going to have in terms of retention rates to year 11 when we're looking at majors. Okay, and we sort of said if we just bring in enough people, we can be somewhat selective when we actually get to year 11, and we can run an 80% selection rate. And as long as we've got an 80% selection rate to make major, like, we're okay. Okay, we haven't done yet, but we're starting to do the hard work. Or what are the skills that we're going to need within that group? How do we target that within that group that have come into the Army? Who do we want to retain? Who don't have the skills for the long-term contribution for the Army? And we effectively sort of let that system run itself. And again, because it's industrial, as long as we've got enough captains to make majors, we say it's okay. We don't know whether we're losing the right skills. We haven't identified the skills in terms of what we want to retain in the long term for the Army. That is now all possible as we start moving to a data-rich environment. We have better visibility of our officers about who are those within our ranks who have the skills that are going to be able to contribute in the future, and who are those who probably don't, and they need to go off and do something else. Again, most companies don't manage their people this way. They don't have some don't have as large the numbers, but the degree with which we just sort of let this system run itself is something that I think is badly in need of change. So we need to start doing some things in the beginning to shape how we bring in our officers and those who we retain for a longer career. The other piece I just like to highlight is no matter what system we create, I think at the end of it, what we're going to want to really focus on is the creation of some diversely talented and highly skilled colonels at that rank. Why colonel, not general? One, because generals aren't that many. Two, colonels now with the ability that Congress gives you, they can retain now to 40 years of time of service. That's a new authorization that's been given us. So you've got the ability to have them stay in positions and contribute longer to the mission. As most of us know who've served in these big staff, colonels are sort of the workhorses for all the large staffs, the Army staff, the Joint Staff, OSD, they're the ones who do this. And so, I think a future system really needs to be optimized in creating those 450 colonels every year. And then from that, you're going to get good general officers if you've done the selection to colonel appropriately. Next slide. So this has been our set sort of overall approach. How do we get from where we are today to where we want to be? Okay, and so what we sought out to do is we sought on the left-hand side to describe the current system as it exists today. You'll see that it is got a number of strengths. It is the very best industrial age practice in terms of management of people that I have ever seen, certainly at this scale. But it's got some gaps that have been identified over time. If you look at the right-hand side and you start talking about an information age system, you see at the core what we're talking about is much more flexibility in terms of career paths. And then as you start looking at the three pillars that are underneath this, we talk about management, organization, and process. So management is about how we manage the officer corps. I think we're going to hit that very heavily with how we look at the Army talent alignment process, which I'll give you some more details on. I think we need to start working on greater organizational alignment, because if you look at who is in charge of managing the strategic direction of the Officer Corps of the United States Army, you'll find out that that authority and the different organizations are disaggregated across the entire Army staff and the Army organization, and it goes from the G3 of the Army to the CAC commander, and it goes to the HRC commander and G1. None of those really come together in any form until you get to the chief or the secretary. And I think over time, as we start getting better organizational alignment, and then the final piece of this is a process by which we start informing senior leaders about how we are on glide path or not on the strategic direction they've defined for not just the officers, but for the people within our Army. Today, and our new Chief of Staff of the Army, General McConville, has started having a regular meeting, a monthly meeting to him that he calls All Things People, in which we come together and we talk about the people enterprise within the Army, so he can make sure that his guidance is being followed, and we can talk about different directions, and we can give him an azimuth check on a monthly basis in terms of where we're going with what he says is his priority in terms of his focus on people. So already making changes in that Army and within the Army staff in terms of being able to put that spotlight into how we're managing our people. So in the middle there, you'll see if you go down further, we start talking about what are the other qualities we want to have. One of those that I think is pretty interesting is start moving forward the use of information technology. Not a sexy topic, but a very important one, okay? So if you actually do a deep dive into all the different personnel systems that we have to manage, not just our officer corps, but all of our people, what you rapidly will find out is that most of the computer programs we have that run were written in the late 80s and early 1990s. What they have is, none of them talk to each other, what they have is an ability to be able to tell you where you are today, and maybe they can tell you where we've been for the last 20 or 30 years, and there is zero predictive quality about any of them. It is only a stretch to say that the officer corps is largely run off of Excel spreadsheets with a little bit of augmentation. But what that means is, when leaders want to make an important decision, we don't have the sort of IT backbone to help support that decision-making process. So when the Secretary of the Army about 6-7 months ago said he wanted to make the mandatory time for a company commander move from 12 months to 18 months across the Army, when we sat down and looked at what the analysis would be, we couldn't come back to him and say, well, this is what this is going to mean in terms of company commanders waiting to go in command. This is what this is going to mean to CGSC timelines in 4 years. This is what this is going to mean in 7 to 8 years in terms of who can go into battalion commander, who's not going to be eligible. We couldn't do any of that extrapolation because none of our systems are really predictive or looking forward yet. So these are all the areas where I think there's opportunities for us to do a much better job of how we bring our data in and then manage our people at a higher level. So we've been told by the chief and the secretary that we were supposed to find subgroups of the officer population. We're supposed to run pilots and prototypes on them, and then rapidly scale them if they're successful to adoption across the entire officer corps. And so we've really looked at 4 pillars. One is the Army talent alignment process. I'll talk to you about this later. That is the way we are now assigning officers across the Army within the active component. Second is this idea of bringing in assessments across the entire career of an officer. Assessments are different than evaluations. Your OERs are by definition a subjective evaluation of what your rater and senior rater think of you. There is no Army standard that absolutely says what that is. When I commanded 1st Brigade of the 101st, I senior rated my company commanders in a different fashion, using a different sort of scoring system, if you want to call it that, than the 2nd and 3rd Brigade commanders, and that's by design. Okay, I think those OERs and I think those insights are always going to be critical and probably the majority of any sort of opinion or decisions that we make about our officers corps. But we're trying to find how do we bring in objective information about our officers to help make better decisions. First, for the officer's own development, okay, so if we sort of imagine that in the first 10 years, assessments are going to be used to have officers see themselves better, understand what their strengths and weaknesses, work on their own development, and maybe figure out where they fit within the Army in order to do that. And then as they become more senior post-CGSC, we start using those assessment vehicles to help make better decisions about how to develop and employ the officers at field grade levels and above. Again, I like to point out that every officer in this room or former officer in this room is very aware of an assessment that we run every 6 months. It's called the APFT, right? So we're very comfortable with assessments in the physical space, not so comfortable in some of these other ones. But the other piece of this, I think, when you start designing assessments across the Army, is you have to understand that assessments are going to drive behaviors, right? So if you looked at the average 40-year-old Army officer and you measure them against the American population, I can guarantee you that there are 3 areas that we all stand out at, okay? And that's our ability to do push-ups in 2 minutes, sit-ups in 2 minutes, and a 2-mile run, because every 6 months you're going to be graded against an objective standard on how to do that. And so as we start looking at developing assessments, we are also trying to nest those in within the skills that we want to have our officer corps be better at over time. Critical thinking, ability to write, verbal communications, things like that. So you'll get a collective uplift from the entire performance of the Army as you start forcing and ensuring that officers understand they're going to be looked at and assessed on those standards. Third piece is this idea of flexible career paths. Congress gave us the authorization to be able to have officers opt out of a promotion board. It's a first step towards driving us towards this idea of a little bit more flexibility in terms of how officers can make choices about the management of their own career. The first time we've done this with the Lieutenant Colonel Selection Board. Early adoption, 4 officers have submitted requests to be able to opt out for 2 years. It is directed by Congress. That's if they're doing something of significant value for the Army. So it's not for a low-performing officer who wants to avoid a promotion board. It's for someone who is, an Olmsted scholar, or who goes off to West Point to teach for a number of years, or is an instructor pilot down at Fort Rucker who needs more time in the cockpit before they come back. And it gives them some career flexibility within their timeline, so when they arrive at a unit, they're not going to be jammed as many people are in order to get to sort of key and developmental positions in order to be viable for promotion moving forward. And then the final one is this idea of promotions and selections. We've really been focusing largely on selections because the chief has a tremendous amount of authority in terms of how he does selections. Promotions are bound by law, and when we're looking at those as well, but the first major move forward with that is the Battalion Commander Assessment Program. I'm going to talk you through in a lot more detail. Next slide. Okay, so I just sort of cut out all the slides. So the Army talent alignment process, I'm going to describe this to you pretty quickly so you can get an idea. So in the legacy system, an officer would come up into an assignment window. They would be contacted by an assignment officer, and based on what happened, they would be given a set number of choices which to have. Sometimes they would get a chance to see everybody. All jobs are available. Sometimes it was limited in terms of what the assignment officer wanted them to be able to see. In that process, it was a moving officer who was negotiating with the assignment officer about what their next assignment is going to be. The current system we're running now is called the Army Talent Alignment Process, which fundamentally changes that and drives it to be a discussion between the individual officer and the unit down to the brigade level, which has now been granted a hiring authority. Okay, so it is not a centralized process by which people are given an assignment and then units receive a sort of tranche of people. It is a commander-involved, commander-empowered hiring process, and it facilitates a dialogue from the individual officer who is moving to the individual unit. So what happens is, as the market is being set, okay, and right now for this movement cycle, because it's next summer, there's about 14,000 jobs that are coming open. Individual officers had to go into this system called AIM-2, the Army Interactive Module 2.0. They need to describe themselves on the front side of their officer record brief, which everyone's familiar with if you've been in the Army. But on the back side, they have a chance to fill out a much more robust resume about what makes them unique as an officer. It also has the opportunity to list references out there for people to be able to contact them. And again, you just have a lot more of a free-form place where you can put information about your unique knowledge, skills, and behaviors, those talents that we say. Individual units now have to go in and describe their openings within their positions, first in the standard duty description, but then also with the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that you want to have within each position. So we now start having an inventory of what skills we want to have. We think that is going to change over time based on position. And now that the market is open, as an individual moving officer, when you go in, you can see every job that you are available for across the entire Army. You can then go and start having a conversation with that hiring authority, and that hiring authority can then start rack and stacking you against everybody else. And when the market closes at the end of November, what's going to happen is individual officers will have had to list their preferences, and they can go as deep as they want to. We recommend officers to go very, very deeply, and they list from 1 to 120 what jobs they wish to have. And then units have a responsibility to develop their own hiring slates, and they should go deeply as well. When the market closes and that process is done, we will then run through a process that is based on preference. It's modeled after the medical school matching model, 2012 Nobel Prize algorithm that was written by a mathematician, that is preference-based of the individual first and then preference-based of the unit second. And so all of a sudden this then goes down and we start finding matches. The basic tenet is that if an individual and a unit agree on a one-to-one match, no one's going to break that. No one's going to hop in the middle of that unless the individual is not qualified to go in that position, or if there is a exceptional family member program issue, or a Merit Armies Couple program, all of which we're trying to get ahead of to making sure that doesn't disrupt it. At the end, we'll get the hiring slate, and that will be what comes out. We're also going to do a pause after we run this and we find out what the slating is to make sure, we're going to do some analysis on to make sure we don't have any negative effects in an unintended way as we have done this. The interesting thing that this has developed, though, is a fundamentally different way of hiring and the way the Army assigns people. And so now all of a sudden, individual officers have much greater ownership of the process. They need to get out there and start talking to people. And what we're finding anecdotally is that it is driving a much more active conversation with individual moving officers and their mentors in terms of, hey, all these jobs are now available to me. I don't have 5 choices. I've got 150. Which ones do you think you should, which ones do you think I'm best qualified for? On the unit level, units have, visibility on everyone who's moving, and then they're being very active in terms of how they're engaging with people, running hiring boards and interview panels. I think of note, although the market's been only open for about a month now, we have put in and we have gotten submitted more than 700,000 officer preferences, across the Army. Okay, so if every officer preferred every job and went right down the slate and did everything, the max number we could have is 1.2 million, and we already have, before the market's closed, 700,000 preferences. Okay, so all the information that we're gathering from this is going to be absolutely critical, because now all of a sudden we're going to have an idea of all sorts of information we never had about our officer, and we can now manage them better, because this becomes a repository of much of that information and assisting us moving into this data-rich environment. All sorts of gains. Officers gain transparency and individual preference. Units gain transparency. They can build their own teams, and the Army gains insights in terms of its officer corps, and we start learning how to manage it better over time. We get all sorts of insights from the data, and I think the next stage of this is going to be the analytics and the information that we learn about this. Next slide, please. So the Battalion Commander Assessment Program, some of you have heard of this, and I'll hit this again, I think just with one slide, but I'll talk you through how we got here. So as we started looking at promotions and selections, one of the things we looked at is, we realized the chief has more maneuver room within the selection process within the promotion system, so we started looking at Battalion Command. Why Battalion Command? Because General McConville will say that Battalion Command is one of the most important decisions that the Army makes. It has an outsized role in terms of the Army's accomplishment of its mission. It has an outsized role in the retention of the best soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and officers within our formations. And it's an absolutely critical decision that the Army makes. But when we did an analysis of how the Army had been making this with a legacy system, what we realized is that a standard board spends about 1 to 2 minutes taking a look at an officer's file. They give them a grade, and then they move on to the next piece. We further sort of analyzed how much information is actually reviewed in an OER, and the fact of the matter is within that OER 2 pages, what's really looked at is the block check in the first and last sentence. And so we quickly figured is that there is generally more information contained in a tweet than relevant information contained in an OER to determine whether you're going to be promoted or selected. And so the question really was, is this the very best way we can do this? And I think the chief started realizing that in his assessment, that we spend more time doing assessments and selections for Ranger privates than we do battalion commanders within our Army. And he said, let's see if we can do a different way. So in June and July, we took a control group of alternate list selectees for battalion command and brought them down to Fort Benning, and one group in June, one group in July. So it was infantry and armor alternate selection list for battalion command. And we ran them through a 5-day process. It's going to be a little different than the one we executed. But what we found is we got dramatically different results. And I can go into those more detailed ones. So a number flat out failed, or didn't fail, but they were just deemed not the right people to put into command. And we also saw significant reordering of the order of merit list when we added all this other information. So what's now has happened in terms of, and what's going to happen is, with the September Lieutenant Colonel's selection board for battalion commander, that board met. There were 1,900 lieutenant colonels who were eligible, and 1,135 opted in to compete for battalion command. That board met, and they went from 1 to 1,135 in terms of a straight rank ordering of them. And then based on the different requirements by branches and functional areas, we identified how many principals and alternate battalion commanders plus an overage, and we identified the number of 816 officers for us to invite to come to Fort Knox from the middle of January to the beginning of February to come and go through a 5-day process by which the Army will start to pick its battalion commanders. Again, 15 January to 9 November, we're going to execute this. 816 officers selected to attend. Some will come and some will be decided not to be selected for. And so let me talk through what that process is going to be. So officers are going to show up and they're going to go through a height weight test. Okay, so they're going to take an APFT, and that APFT is going to be a scored event, obviously, and we're going to use that score. They're then going to go through a series of psychological assessments. They're going to take a cognitive, non-cognitive assessment. They're going to take a writing diagnostic test, both computer-based and then a writing sample. Okay, at the end of that process, as they go through that, they're then going to go through a panel interview process, but it's a panel interview process that's a little bit different, and it is a blind panel interview process. Okay, so we're trying to eliminate the biases that exist within the nature of the interviewing process. And so what will happen is a candidate will show up, report into a room, and he'll report behind a screen. On the other side of the screen, you'll have a 2-star general, 2 1-star generals, and 2 former brigade commanders. They'll ask a series of they will ask a series of behavioral-based questions, and they'll be the same across the different panels, which will start to elicit sort of information about the officer. I failed to mention one other critical piece. We have sought out to bring in peer and subordinate information about the officer candidates, about the candidates for battalion command. Okay, and so in the largest attempt by the Army to ever do this, about 3 weeks ago, we sent out 26,000 surveys across the Army to peers and subordinates of the candidates saying, you worked with Major Smith. Tell us how he was as a subordinate. Tell us how he was as a peer. And we're bringing that information and folding that into the entire process in terms of gaining the insight on the officer. So at the end of this panel, and so just so if you want to look at how much the force has really bought into it. So we sent out 26,000, about 2,500 were like, hey, I don't know this person, I can't fill this out. But of those who actually said they knew him, we've already had a 50% participation rate for the survey, which if anyone has done surveys, that's a really high participation rate. We've still got another 10 days or so before it's supposed to be closed out. So at the end of this process, the panel that is meeting there is going to finish the interview with the candidate, and then they're going to make a simple, should this officer go into command or not? And that's going to be the process. At the end of that, so you'll see that, and then if the person passes the BCAP, what happens is we then reestablish the OML. OML is going to be reestablished on 5 different factors. So one is past performance. So your OERs do matter, and that is being brought forward as part of your score. So how you actually rank based on the centralized selection board. Physical fitness is measured by the APFT, written communications, your assessment of potential based on cognitive, non-cognitive assessments, and then your verbal communication as judged by your panel interview. That's going to reorder the OML. We give that OML then to HRC, and then they decide, and then they'll establish who gets the cutoff for being a principal battalion commander and who is an alternate. So again, a fundamentally different way for us to go through the selection process for battalion command. We think at the end of this that the sort of key is that more relevant information leads to better decisions, and I think this helps eliminate many of the blind spots of the legacy system that we've used to pick battalion commanders. Next slide. Why is this important? I think we've already talked about the importance of battalion command, and I think most people understand it. I think it drives positive behaviors. It will screen out those who we determine to be unfit for command. Based on the prototype that we ran, there were really a couple main reasons. Some just couldn't pass height weight test. Okay, that's sort of on them. Some were deemed not to be cognitively capable of being able to handle the responsibilities at that level. And we identified at least one leader who was identified as a toxic leader who shouldn't be put in charge of a formation based on multiple different sort of feeds of information. And then at the end of this, I think we're going to have a whole lot more information by which we can better manage this important cohort of officers as we move forward. Next slide. I think that's it. So that is as quick as I can present that. Normally I take a lot longer.
Okay, folks, it's just a quick reminder. It's not too late to vote for your questions. We're going to go to the Q&A portion right now.
Okay, so to get to the questions again, it's www.ausa.org/Q&A, and you have an opportunity to vote for questions and upvote them in the order here. So we'll go ahead and get started. General McGee, your first question is how is the Army's talent alignment process accounting for dual military officers? Specifically, how will the marketplace help assign officers together if they are not in the same marketplace cycle? Will HRC retain the power to push officers to assignments to keep couples together?
So, what you're talking about is the Merit Army's Couple Program, which is still in effect, and HRC is still the oversee of executing that. And so HRC will have to, help shape preferences and how officers shape those preferences in the very beginning of the process. But we're still, that program still exists. They still receive preference, and it will be worked in a different manner than it was because the system's different. But the priority is still to try to get Merit Army's couples together.
Okay, sir, the next question we're seeing is most popular. How do we better understand what talent is leaving our Army?
So it's a great question. And I think, we have already done a pretty good job of starting to harvest that information. And now we've got to start doing the analysis and figure out. So I think in terms of talents leaving the Army, first off, I think we as an Army need to figure out what are those talents that we actually want to have within the Army for the long term. And then I think we've got enough assessment vehicles built into how we're already looking at certainly the officers that we're bringing in right now. So I know most people aren't tracking, but officers now, whether they come from ROTC or OCS or West Point, go through this process called talent-based branching, where we do a number of assessments on them. We use that to help them make their selections for which branch they're going to go into. We now have got that database of information. I think we can use that, plus other assessments we run at the basic course, the Captain's Career Course, to figure out what are those talents that we want to have, who are the officers that have it, and how we can do a better job of identifying them within our formations, and then managing them and then retaining them.
Thank you, sir. Next question, does the Army's talent management system incorporate the civilian workforce? If not, will it in the future?
So it will over time. So right now, with conjunct with AUSA, the first ever Army People Strategy was unveiled by the Chief and the Secretary. Dr. Rudinsky was the hand that was actually working this and putting this all together. So we have a coherent strategy. The guidance to us has been to first start with the Officer Corps. We've recently received guidance to start working with the Non-Commissioned Officer Corps, and then this will all inform the effort in parallel that is being done for how we start looking at the management of the civilian cohort within our Army as well. So I think they're all complementary.
Sir, do you see an increased opportunity for nepotism, which would not necessarily be bad, a commander being able to select somebody they know and trust that should be a good thing, but it doesn't mean then that the best talent is getting the best position? What measures are being put into place to prevent this?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and it's one that comes up all the time, and it's one that we spend a fair amount of time looking at. So you've got to unpack this a little bit. So let's talk about the current system or the legacy system that we've done. Okay, so who knows whether nepotism exists within the current system or not? The answer is we don't know, right? It's all done through this BNR process, by name request. Senior leaders request people. There's no record of these things. We don't know actually who hired what. We don't know the sort of history of what that came out. And that's worked okay, but it has served as a de facto black market to the entire assignment process that has been operating for years and years. Now all of a sudden we've got a transparent system that allows people to see who the hirings are, who people hire and what those relationships are. There's another piece of this that makes it a little bit problematic, because if you look at all these things, you've got really two decisions that you need to make. So one is, do you want to regulate these sort of issues within the marketplace, or two, do you want to just be able to illuminate them and make sure that we've got visibility on these? And with nepotism, when you take it to the next level, like what is actually nepotism? So we don't have a definition within the Army. So if I've worked for General Pyatt once before in the last 10 years and he wants me to work for him again, is that nepotism? Or is it only nepotism when I've only worked for General Pyatt for the last 10 years? And then, how much do you actually want to try to regulate that and establish a series of rules? And so in this, what we said was a couple things. One, we're going to trust commanders, because we've already, we're going to empower the commanders with the authority to do this hiring, and we're going to trust them to do this responsibly. And we specifically have called out in the execution order for this that commanders are going to be, looked at and evaluated based on how they conduct their hiring practices. But we decided we didn't want to regulate this for the first one, and then we're going to run the data and we're going to see whether this is driving us to have heavily nepotistic hiring process or not. I tend to think it will not. But we've now got a mechanism set up where we can actually look and evaluate that and see whether that is the case. And frankly, if it's a problem, we can make modifications for how we execute this in the future. But in this first iteration, we thought we were going to empower and trust commanders to exercise this responsibility and assume that that's what's going to happen. And if not, then we'll have to make some adjustments.
Sir, regarding the battalion commander assessment, what role does the officer's past manner performance play in selection for battalion command?
So the past manner performance is going to be the the leadership of the Army has decided with the scoring, how the different breakdown is, but that's supposed to be kept opaque. But the largest single part of the candidate's score is going to be his or her manners performance as judged by how they performed, how their files were evaluated and measured in the central selection board process. So that score is carried forward and combined with all the other elements of it to include the cognitive, non-cognitive assessment, the writing test, the verbal communications, and the APFT.
Okay, sir, I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. So this could be the last one here. With the ability for officers to potentially serve for much longer at their current rank, as well as the option to opt out of promotions, how will we ensure the promotion opportunity rates aren't hindered?
So that's a great question. And I mean, all of these things become, the downstream effect. And frankly, we're trying to figure out what that right balance is. I mean, what happens when you start letting officers opt early into promotions? What happens when you let officers stay in longer, and how you manage that? We don't have a firm answer on that yet, but certainly all of these things are going to be related. If you keep a major for a longer period of time, that means one less captain you're going to be able to make in its most simplistic. And what that balance look like and how that actually is going to be performed is something we're trying to figure out right now. Carrie, I think we've got time for one more.
Okay, so
I got to tell you, with this format, they just keep coming. At least in the other format, you had to wait a second while they pass stuff out.
That's good, sir. We get to answer
It's like heavy suppressive fire coming from one location.
Sir, so this is one question we see a lot too. What efforts are made to ensure the Army National Guard is included in the momentum behind Army talent management?
So, we have reached out to Army, Guard, and Reserve leadership, asked them to participate. We've got one National Guard officer on our team, and we have 2 Reserve officers, and we've been told that there are going to be more coming our way to help us see this. I think, within each of those components, they manage their officer corps a little bit differently, and so I think a lot of these things can't be a direct lift, but I think the concepts and the principles certainly could be, and I know there's a lot of interest from both the Guard and Reserve to start moving this into their components. Okay? Sure.
Well, thanks very much, General McGee. And that is pretty rapid fire. I mean, you don't get much of a break. That's pretty interesting. And I'll look to the team and say, for the questions that we weren't able to get time to, will the team be able to answer them since you have that repository of questions?
Yes, sir, we're able to export the questions. Then we'll get out to most of our team and get back out.
Yeah, good. That's a great process, and so thanks for that. Thanks for those very interesting insights. Joe McGee and I were talking before breakfast. There's a lot of deep Army culture that's being challenged in this endeavor, and frankly, as much as I love Joe McGee and Dr. Wardinsky, they're not going to be the ones that affect this change. You are. The captains and majors and lieutenant colonels that are involved in this system. You're going to be the ones that drive this, and I hope this morning's breakfast has given you some insights into how that change is going to be affected across the Army. So thanks very much for that very insightful presentation. We look for continuing discussion on this very important topic. And again, once again, ladies and gentlemen, please extend a warm thanks to SOS International, Lieutenant General Retired Helmick and his team. Thanks for your sponsorship. And some of you will see in Detroit next week, and then a couple weeks after that, please, the 4th of December for Army Acquisition and Contracts. Thank you very much. Let's have an Army Strong Day. Thank you.